financial markets and fintech through his blog, The Financier. His latest book, his 16th, is called Doing Digital, and shares the lessons of doing digital transformation learned through interviews that he's had with BBVA, very timely, China Merchants Bank, DBS, ING, and JP Morgan Chase. ValueWeb describes the impact of fintech and how mobile and blockchain technologies are changing the face of finance and building an internet of value. As a result of the emerging internet of value, banks have come to become digitalized, and Digital Bank, Chris's book, provides a comprehensive review and analysis of the battle for digital banking and strategies for companies to compete. In his spare time, in his day job, he's chair of the European Networking Forum, the Financial Services Club, chair of the Nordic Finance Innovation, as well as being a non-executive director of the fintech consultancy firm 11FS. And David Birch, also an author. Dave is an advisor and commenter on digital financial services. He leads 15 MB Limited. That's his advisory practice. I hope I said that right, Dave. He's global ambassador for Consult Hyperion, the secure electronics transaction consultancy that he helped to found. Technology fellow at the Center for the Study of Financial Innovation. It's a London-based think tank. He's a visiting professor at the University of Surrey Business School, and he holds a number of board-level advisory roles. Before helping to found Consult Hyperion in 1986, he spent several years working as a consultant in Europe, the Far East, and North America. He graduated from the University of Southampton with the BS honors in physics. Dave was named one of the global top 15 favorite sources of business information by Wired magazine, one of the top 10 most influential voices in banking by Financial Brand, and was rated Europe's most influential commentator on emerging payments by Total Payments. Dave also has a recent book, The Currency Cold War, that walks us through the high-level economic and social stakes, as well as the technical and commercial pros and cons of the different combatants in the currency wars to come. So let me turn it over to our panelists, each for about 5 minutes, to sort of give us some context in terms of what we're going to be talking about today. So Chris, you want to kick us off?
Sure, thanks Kevin, and thanks Betsy for inviting me along today. It's nice that you've got two Englishmen to commentate on what's happening with central digital currencies, although as I live in Poland, I'll claim to be a European and not an Englishman right now. I've been here for a few years. We live in interesting times. We always say that. Things are always changing. And you know, if you go back 10 or 15 years, we had lots and lots of conferences and discussions about the war on cash and the fact that we wanted to automate payment processes using contactless payments and maybe the mobile telephone, which at that time was still an emerging technology. It wasn't something that dominated our lives like it does today. And in particular, the war on cash was very much a Visa, MasterCard focus, because the idea was to get us to move to cards in Europe and America. And then we saw a massive movement towards mobile payments in Asia, specifically in China, using QR codes, a different technology that hadn't succeeded in Europe and America, but has succeeded in China. And when Ant Group, which runs Alipay, the biggest payment system in China, came to market, or tried to come to market with an IPO the other day, the figures are quite stunning in that they're processing over $17 trillion US dollars on mobile QR codes. Whereas in the US, I think you're probably processing maybe $300 billion, if that, on mobile wallets. In Europe, it's also tiny. And what we've seen is this dichotomy between Asia, Europe, and America, and old technologies and new technologies. And the result is that some countries want to be leaders in innovation, like Sweden, China, and a number of other territories, and create central bank digital currencies as a new way of creating an efficient economy. But it has a number of challenges. in that a central bank issued currency, when it's digital, is traceable and auditable and controlled. Whereas if it's in paper form as a cash currency, it can be used in a very different way, which is why we see more US dollars transacted outside America than inside America, because the US dollar as a transfer of value with an immediate trust has that capability to be completely anonymous. And this is one of the big challenges around central bank digital currencies. Another part of it is that when Facebook announced Libra, which would be a digital currency on social media, it really sent a rocket up the backside of most central banks to say, we've got to do something now. They'd watched Bitcoin, they'd watched Ether, they'd watched Ripple, they'd seen cryptocurrencies rising, but they didn't worry about them because they were decentralized and distrusted by most people and too complicated for most people. But suddenly Facebook was going to democratize money using Libra. Oh my God, that really sent a shock to the system of every bank around the world and every government around the world, bearing in mind that currency is a government trust. And this is one of the critical factors I always come back to. I'm happy to debate it here because David may disagree with me, but it's the question of what is backing the currency. Where is the trust? When you have Bitcoin and it's democratized across the internet and you trust the internet network technology to manage the trust, some people accept that, but I think the majority do not. Then we move to an area which was gray in the middle around and that, I guess, is the core of the debate we're in right now, which is in 2020, we want to get rid of cash. We don't trust cash because it spreads germs. So we want to replace it with something else, replace it with a central bank digital currency, a stable coin, a Facebook Libra, a Bitcoin. Who knows? There's an open playing field for the next decade of money. And it's really down to, who do you trust? Who do you trust to be good for the money? Do you trust the government? Do you trust the internet? Do you trust Satoshi Nakamoto, even though no one knows who he is? And that, I think, is the core of where we are right now. My money, if I was a betting man, would be on central bank digital currencies because they're backed by central banks who are backed by governments. And I'm often accused of being a statist, as in I believe in state control. But I think if you remove state control, if you remove government, if you remove governance, you have anarchy. And that's the real extremes of where we are today. That if you really said everything could be controlled just by technology, just by people on the internet who trusted the network, and there's no government, then I think there's huge questions to be asked about how that's managed, which is why central bank digital currencies are really exciting. In conclusion, I think central bank digital currencies will succeed because they're backed by central banks and therefore backed by governments. But I think we're going to end up with maybe something that emerges out of this. I've debated for quite a while on my blog, which is a global currency. And I don't really see why we need to have a dollar, a euro, a yuan, when the internet doesn't recognize countries or borders. So we end up with something that maybe is a global central bank currency, but that's part of a basket of currencies that can be transacted globally and used as something recognized by every country as having value, not just a value in China, Europe, and America.
Thanks, Chris. Dave?
I wasn't quite sure what you guys would be interested in around this. So what I did was I put together a couple of slides just to sort of illustrate the thinking about it. And I'm just going to see if I can show those. So if I go to share screen, and then I choose wait, what? Now I'm on 2. What?
Yes, the second one just came in. Oh, yes. Now I think we lost Dave.
Okay, can you see me now?
Yes.
That was
There we
weird.
go.
Okay, right. Let's go back to my nutty PowerPoint idea. And so in order to have a proper discussion, I mean, I know you're going to say I'm being too nerdy about this, but in order to have a proper discussion, we have to have some kind of shared vocabulary, some sort of shared I mean, because I'm not just for the sake of the discussion, but obviously I disagreed with essentially everything that Chris said. But in order to show you why, I need to flesh things out a little bit. So let's try with this PowerPoint. Right, here we go. Right, so can you guys see that okay? Okay, can anybody see that okay?
Yeah, we're good.
Okay, good. Right. So I wanted to just take you a little through the kind of options for different kinds of CBDC so that we could then have a discussion about the pluses and minuses of the different approaches. So this is my tree. This is like the how did we get here evolutionary tree. Okay. So I'm just going to quickly walk you. You're going to see why we're going to end up in the bottom right-hand corner, but I want you to see why. So if you start off at the top of the tree, you can see that there's a very simple split between electronic money and electronic cash. And electronic money is stuff that lives in bank accounts. Electronic cash is stuff that lives essentially outside bank accounts. And money that lives in accounts is boring, and we're not going to talk about it anymore. You know, we can have separate discussions about FedNow and Venmo and all these other things. So there's money that lives in accounts, which basically is almost all money at the moment. So remember when we're talking about cash and banknotes and stuff like that, they're the vanishing, there's a tiny, tiny fraction. Almost all money is electronic money that lives in accounts. Electronic cash is money that lives in wallets, just like dollar bills and so on. Essentially, we've got two options for implementing that. We can either do it as like a single system, or we can do something with multiple operators. If we're going to do it as a single system, then we basically have to choose between, do we have a public operator or do we have a private operator? If we're going to do it with multiple operators, we need some way to synchronize between those multiple operators. This is what the money people call the double spending problem. Mark Zuckerberg famously said that he wanted to make sending money around the internet as simple as sending photos around the internet, but of course it isn't, because when I send you photos of my cat on Facebook, I'm not actually sending you the photo, I'm sending you a copy of it. I've still got the photo of my cat. You've got a copy of the photo of my cat. That's great for cat photos, not so good for cash, I mean, generally speaking. So if we're going to have multiple operators, we need to find a way to stop that double, so I can send pictures of my cat to Chris and I can send another picture of my cat to Kevin, and that's all great. But if I send dollar bills to Kevin and I send copies of them to Chris, who's got the real dollar bills? I do. Tough luck, suckers. So how do we present that kind of double spending? Well, there's two ways of doing that, essentially. We can either do it in hardware, because we've got to stop things from being copied. So we can either do it in hardware using chips, or we can do it in software with some kind of ledger to record the transactions. And if we're going to do it using ledgers, then basically we have two ways of doing it. We can do it as a centralized ledger, which is quite easy. That's just like a big database. Or we can do it as a decentralized ledger, in which case we need some clever cryptography to make it all work. So that's my tree. Now, as you can see from my clever color coding, I've put three things in white, because I'm going to persuade you those are the only three ways that we can actually implement digital currency. We don't need to talk about the rest of them. And I can illustrate that by pointing out that this has already been done. So if we go, how do you get to the next slide? Oh, there we go. So if we're going to do it with a single operator, well, that'd be something a bit like M-Pesa, but in Kenya. So, we could get just, one big database, do all the transactions there. the cost per transaction in that is essentially naught. It's, you know, it's negligible. It's approaching zero, and that works at population scale, and so we don't need to worry about that anymore. We'll rule out doing that as a public operator because you know, no central bank, well, the central banks we're interested in, the Fed, Bank of England, and so on, aren't remotely interested in running a system. They don't want to run a call center. They don't want people sending in letters, where's my money? So they're not going to run. So we can forget about that. Private is the only way to do that single system. If we're going to do it with multiple operators, we could do it using chips, and we already did that. That was called Mondex. That was the first global digital currency. That was in the mid-1990s. And for one reason or another, that didn't work. Now, obviously, if you were going to do that, and that was done using smart cards, of course, because of the times. But if you were going to do that now, you wouldn't use smart card chips. You use chips in mobile phones and other devices. But nonetheless, you know, it worked. If you look at doing the software version with ledgers, we're going to rule out the centralized approaches to that because for some of the reasons that Chris was touching on, which is, you know, if one person can see all of the transactions, I mean, that sounds good if you're the People's Bank of China. That sounds not so good if it's going to be Bank of America or Wells Fargo or somebody. So I don't think we want somebody to see all of the transactions. So we'll have a decentralized version, and also because we need to do something clever as well in a minute, which I'll show you. And for a variety of reasons, I think that we should think about looking at the sort of what people call the token solution, so that not the balance solution. Because, you know, with balances, you're basically, it's just, you know, if we want the real benefits of this, then we need to go for the technologically most sophisticated platform. Now, if you look at what various people have been saying about this, and when I say various people, I mean, you know, basically, I mean, no one cares what I think about this stuff. It's not important. But what the Bank of England think about it, what the European Central Bank think about it, and so on. And if you look at what they're saying, they're all pointing down in that bottom right-hand corner. So in the European Central Bank report that came out last month, they basically looked at section 6.2.1 is looking at hardware, 2.2 is looking at software. But I draw your attention to 6.3, which says more advanced techniques could be used whereby cryptographic proof is computed, blah, blah, blah. So that's where we're all looking in that bottom right-hand corner. And depending on whose vision of this you're interested in, so we'll come back to it in a second. So basically, out of all of the different ways of doing it, there's actually only 3 ways of doing it. So let's have a quick look at those 3 ways of doing it. If we did it with a private operator, that's the cheapest and simplest way to run it. But of course, it's also a single point of failure and a honeypot. And if that system goes down, it causes you know, significant problems. M-Pesa does fail from time to time. But more importantly than M-Pesa failing, in developed economies, so for example, in the UK, the British economy, to a first approximation, is RTGS. RTGS is the Bank of England real-time gross settlement system. It carries £635 billion a day. That is the British economy. It's the most systemically most important computer system in Britain, as far as I'm concerned. Maybe that one that runs nuclear power stations, but to me, you know, that's the most important one. And that's failed twice in the last 5 years. And for astute students of central bank clearing and settlement, you'll have noticed that the European settlement system, TIPS, a couple of Fridays ago went down for a whole afternoon. So even the best designed systems that have the most money spent on them, they're going to go down from time to time. Sooner or later, someone's going to unplug it because they want to do the vacuuming, and then nobody can make any transactions. So let's rule out the private operator at the beginning. Let's not rule out distributed hardware. And that's for a very good reason, which is we might want to do something that we can only do with distributed hardware, which is offline transactions. So one of the issues with a cash replacement, if it's going to be a true cash replacement, you could argue it has to work in places where there are no networks or connections. And if you're going to do that, we can't rely on any kind of software to help us through that long term. So we need hardware for that. So let's not rule that out. Actually, hardware so that we can do person to person is not a bad idea. If we look at the third case, which is the decentralized software solution, we're very focused on APIs and what people very misleadingly call smart contracts, because they aren't smart and they aren't contracts, but let's call them persistent scripts, Buterin style. But that's where the real potential for innovation is. And if you look at the Bank of England consultation paper, which is a very good paper, by the way, they talk about sort of the cost savings and so on, but who cares? The real reason we're interested in this is because it's a platform for innovation in the economy. Dollar bills don't have APIs, but digital dollars would. So are we going to build Fed Pesa? No. Are we going to build Fed Dex? Maybe. Are we going to build Fed Coin? Probably. Now, sorry. If we look at, oh, sorry, that's meant for somebody else. Go away. Okay, sorry. Right, so if we just look at my little model here of how that might work, we have some, why can't I use PowerPoint? What the hell is wrong with me? Okay, there we go, right. So if we look at this little diagram of how it's all going to work, we've got some sort of ledger system that passes digital value around. And then we have two different institutional bindings. We have a binding that links those tokens to some value in the real world. As Chris incorrectly called it, a stable coin. It's actually a currency basket, but it doesn't matter, we'll pass over that. So in this particular case. But it could be anything, gold and square inches of the Mona Lisa and, feet of an office building or whatever, Knicks tickets, doesn't matter. There's a binding that links those tokens to values in the real world. And there's a binding that links the wallets to legal entities in the real world. And to pretend that's not going to exist is ridiculous, because no central bank will allow the system unless that binding's in place. So that's a very simple model of the system. And that, I think, gives us what might well be the optimum strategy in this direction, which is, instead of building a central bank digital currency platform, what we do is build a generalized digital asset platform, which is good for the economy as a whole, because it reduces the cost of financial intermediation by taking out clearing and settlement. And then the central bank just becomes one of these bindings. It just becomes the N+1th binding, but it just happens that it binds the tokens to central bank money as opposed to square inches of the Mona Lisa or feet of an office building or whatever. So this is why, all things considered, I think that's the best way forward, and that's what we should be talking about. That will give us two parallel systems. It will give us a system for electronic money, which is being moved over to instant payments and ISO 20022. And it will give us a separate system for electronic cash, which is running over the internet and wallets. The interfaces between those ledgers and the central bank settlement accounts are, quite straightforward to think about. And there's an ecological advantage to this approach, because those systems will be implemented using completely different infrastructures. And so if one of them goes wrong, the other one will work okay. Or as somebody said to me in a different context earlier today, when the big quake comes and California drifts off into the Pacific, somehow we've got to keep some money going. And so are we going to do that using electronic money? Probably not. Will we do it using electronic cash? Hopefully, if we implement offline transactions. So there we go.
Thanks, Dave. So let me give Chris 2 minutes for a rebuttal, but first, throw out a question of the trust issue, as well as the stability issue in terms of having a currency be a currency. So I guess the most obvious question, which is not really a particularly sophisticated, but I think is important, is how, from a cultural perspective, how do we get uptake? How do we get receptivity from folks, everyday users, not smart people who understand sort of the nuances of the digital currency and the central bank part of it, but just the average.
I just read a thing earlier today talking about the distribution of government subsidies in Central and Latin America. So in America, to provide subsidies to people, they print out checks and put them in the post and then send them out. many of them to people who are still alive, actually. So the system isn't all completely hopeless. But in places like South America, they just told people, if you want the subsidy, you've got to get a wallet. And doesn't matter which bank you choose, which mobile operator you choose, you get an electronic wallet, and then we'll distribute the funds into that. So, you know, the shifting over to digital currency, I think, is not that hard.
Well, that's, and again, sorry, Chris, I'll let you take it up.
Apologies, Chris, sorry.
I'm sorry, Dave. Let Chris go for a minute, but just a quick question, Chris. So what Dave just described, for example, in South America, how do you go from the process where that money gets digitally delivered to them transferring that to go buy food from the market down the street?
Yeah, I think there's a number of factors that we need to roll back to basics. And first of all, I didn't say that Libra was a stable coin, David, just to be clear. Basically, we have to talk about the essence of what money and banking is all about. Yeah, money is an exchange of value that's trusted, that we can then use to exchange for value elsewhere. And it never loses that value. The same is true in banking, that banking is viewed as being a safe and trusted store of value that can exchange that value between individuals and institutions and across borders, and will not lose that value and that trust. That's the very essence of financial markets. That's the basics. And so many people don't get that. A lot of fintech startups are hugely naive about how financial markets work. We don't ask to be regulated the way we're regulated because we like it. We're regulated the way we're regulated because we have that trust to store and exchange value across borders and between individuals and organizations. And we won't lose that value. And this, to me, is the criticality of why central bank digital currencies will end up being much more mainstream than stable coins and cryptocurrencies, which is for the average person on the street who's buying some food from the local store on the corner, they've got no idea what the hell goes on in the background. All they want to know is that if they present to that store owner the money to buy the goods digitally or physically, that it will be accepted and trusted and recognized as valuable. And that is the essence of money and banking. And we overlook this too often because we have all these fantastic allegorical ideas about how technology can transform the world. For the average person going to the local store to buy a loaf of bread, they've got no idea what's going on. They just want to know it can be paid and trusted.
Dave, you want to jump in here?
I think, you know, the people going to I'll tell you this is a true, I'll tell you a true story. When I was in Minnesota last, it was the Economic Club of Minnesota. I went to, my taxi driver from the airport asked me what I was doing, and I told him I was going to this event to talk about electronic money. And it turned out he was Somalian. And he said, well, we know when I go home to Somalia, when we go to buy bananas, this is a real example. So when we go to buy bananas, in the market, we use mobile phones. The point is, and they, you know, so I go to the market and I buy the bananas with my mobile wallet. Now, under the hood, as Chris says, the distinction between money that's held in an account somewhere and money that's held in a wallet is opaque. You know, that's of interest to people like us and people and regulators and people who are interested in the stability of the system. But the only difference that people would notice is that they could send money to each other as well as to the shopkeeper, I guess. I mean, I don't know why it would be more complicated than that.
But I think that's the interesting thing around what we saw in China with Tencent WePay and Ant Group's Alipay with Alibaba, which is, as I say, you know, trillions of dollars moving through mobile wallets because they didn't have an effective payments mechanism that was with the critical mass across the nation beforehand. And when this service appeared and everyone said it works, the more it worked, the more it became trusted. I go back to a little bit like how I started using PayPal. And I don't know about your experiences, but when I first started using PayPal, it's at least 15 years ago or more. And to begin with, I didn't trust it. So I just used it for very small transactions. But the more it worked, the more I used it, the more I used it for higher value transactions, the more I ended up living in a PayPal world. And that's something that hasn't happened with the majority of the Main Street consumers in USA and Europe, but it has happened with the majority of Main Street consumers in China, probably because they didn't have the density of payment mechanisms that we use in Europe and America and China at that time. They did have credit cards, they did have debit cards, but not with the propensity that we have them. And so what you end up with is the USA and Europe, particularly USA, looking a little bit backward because people still use checks. I don't know why we don't use them in Europe or anywhere else in the world. They still use plastic cards, which makes sense because you have to have a motivation and a reason for using something else. The motivation and the reason why Chinese people used WeChat Pay and Alipay is because they get loyalty programs, discounts and benefits that you wouldn't get if you use cash. And so you have to change consumer behavior as part of this. And a central bank digital currency will not succeed. In fact, any currency, Libra, Bitcoin, you name it, will not succeed without a good reason why a consumer should spend it and use it.
Okay, so
I think you have to take into account the so I mean, Chris is I mean, in fact, I've got Chris's book behind me, so I've actually read those case studies. So I mean, broadly, but you've also got to look at the regulatory environment. I mean, you know, WeChat and Alipay, there was like a regulatory gap in the fence they could get through, you know. And you know, the government was happy to let that happen. It's funny actually, because in China the government is now tightening up the fintech regulation because those guys have been so successful. In the US, they're finally talking about loosening it, because in the US the regulation has essentially favored the incumbents at the expense of you know, if you want to try and start a new payment system, you know, to compete with PayPal or whatever, you've got to go get money transmission licenses in all of the states, and you've got to you can't have direct access to the clearing and settlement systems and all these other kind of things. So there's a regulatory interplay there, which I think people overlook when they look at the. I mean, I can show you articles from 1970 saying, you know, credit cards are never going to succeed. And if you talk to people in this audience broadly, they would probably say, well, you know, we got better technology because we got the mag stripe in 71, access to base one authentication. But actually, there was a big regulatory change as well, which allowed people to charge enormous interest rates in Delaware, I think it was originally, wasn't it? Which meant that credit cards could become profitable. So there's an interplay between the technology and the regulation here, which I think is important. I mean, if you wanted to put the cat among the pigeons, there's already been one bill, hasn't there, in New York State about creating a New York State currency, which is separate from the dollar. And if you want a you know, touching on Patty's question in the question channel, I would say it's impossible to imagine that this won't end up with more currencies, not a single currency, because the ability to create currencies is now, you know, decentralized. And again, I mean, I'm doing this to wind you guys up, but basically, if New York wanted to issue its own money, all they have to do is say New York taxes have to be paid in New York money. End of story. That's it. As soon as you can pay taxes in it, it becomes money. And as soon as it becomes money, it becomes valuable and people will want it.
So Dave and Chris, just a quick question. So taking the point that Dave just made in terms of we're likely to see more currencies, isn't there some risk that, you know, look, inevitably something always goes wrong? And if something goes wrong, even with an obscure, you know, the New York token or whatever currency, doesn't that have implications for the entire structure?
Well, I'm okay on that one.
Well, I mean, that's an argument against
David again, because I was making the point at the start that you have to look at what's under the hood. What is it that backs the currency, the asset, that makes it valuable, that makes you trust that it's something you can use? And so to Dave's example of the New York dollar, or whatever it be called, it's very similar to community currencies, where you have a Brixton pound and a Lewis pound in Britain, for example. But they're trusted locally. They're not trusted across the UK because they can only be used in Lewis or Brixton or New York. So it's really down to, under the hood, what is it that is the asset that you have that makes you trust that that is valuable? And going back, to the Bretton Woods Agreement, we used to have gold as the asset behind currency. Then we took that away, and then the USA, as the superpower, became the federal currency of the world, the reserve currency of the world. As we go forward, and we're in a very interesting moment right now, as we look towards the next decade, what will be the reserve currency of the world? Some people are questioning whether it is the dollar. Personally, I think it will continue for the foreseeable, but you could equally, as I said at the beginning, see a basket of global currencies tied to an internet protocol that becomes really interesting as not a central bank digital currency, but a collation of central bank digital currencies that are a stable coin that could be rolled into a Libra, but Libra is not a stable coin, going back to what I said to you, David. So it's really down to all about the trust, the store of value, the exchange of value, and what you believe is the asset behind the thing that you're using to pay and receive goods.
I'm not sure about that, Chris, and I'm not sure about it for a couple of different reasons. So the first is, as soon as we look some reasonable distance into the future, almost all transactions won't involve people at all. It won't be what currency do I trust or whatever, because it'll be my car talking to the charging meter that's doing the transaction. I mean, I won't even be in the loop. So if my car and the city of New York agree that they need to get New York dollars to pay for a parking space, or whatever else, gold, or it doesn't matter. I mean, I don't care. I mean, I won't even be part of that loop, so it doesn't matter. And my supercomputer at the end of a mobile phone and your supercomputer at the end of a mobile phone, in a couple of nanoseconds, can negotiate what basket of tokens they want to exchange for a particular.
But
it's not going to involve people. I already don't want to be involved in those decisions now. I had a call with my pensions guy on Friday, and he's trying to explain.
Your machines, your devices have to trust the exchange.
No, they have to trust the markets. So let's say your parking space wants New York dollars and my phone hasn't got any New York dollars. Well, then we've got to agree on a trusted market where we can exchange my London dollars for your New York dollars. But you're talking about something that will happen in nanoseconds, and none of us will ever be involved in it. So I don't see that as quite the barrier. And in fact, I see it the opposite. I think the way that the economy works at the moment is showing us there's a vast gulf between I'll at a very gross level, cities and rural. Which I think you can't reconcile. I don't really understand why West Virginia and California have the same currency. They need different interest rates. And they need, so when you want to sort of loosen monetary policy in some areas, but not in others, it's, you can't do that if everyone's using the same currency. But also when you think about it, those tokens that we're talking about, suppose my crackpot theory is correct, and you have a digital asset trading infrastructure where my mobile phone and your mobile phone will negotiate baskets of tokens to exchange with each other. It's not absolutely obvious to me that central bank digital currency will be much used in that environment, because why would you use that intermediary? Like if I'm trying to save up, I don't know, I'm trying to save up electricity for my retirement. Why would I save money that I'm going to buy electricity with when I retire? Why wouldn't I just save electricity, if you see what I mean? So I'm not even sure about that aspect of it. And the point about the dollar, I think, is really interesting. And I mean, Chris makes a really interesting point there, because I'm sure he's right that the dollar is going to remain the reserve currency for some time, not necessarily because of the unit of account, but because of, you know, because being the reserve currency isn't just about the dollar, it's about the American legal system and, you know, American corporate law and all this kind of thing. And, you know, China's got a long way to go to compete with that. However, it doesn't take that much of a knock to start causing America problems. So, for example, suppose 95% of all global transactions are carried out in dollars. It's actually about 80% at the moment. But let's imagine it's 95%. So almost all trade is carried out in dollars, but 5% of it isn't. 5% of it is carried out in North Korean Super E1 or something. But it turns out there are some things you can buy with North Korean Super E1 that you can't buy with US dollars, nuclear weapons, for example. Then the demand for North Korean E1 would be quite high, irrespective of its economic value. So when you're talking about competition between different currencies, yes, there's economics that are part of it, but there are plenty of countries around the world, even American allies, who are not absolutely thrilled with the entire world economic system being cleared through the New York money center banks. I mean, that sounds good if you're America, but it doesn't sound good if you're other people. And you know, you think of countries that, I mean, the Economist, which is not the most liberal of publication. I mean, it is liberal, but it's not. But I mean, the Economist said that American financial sanctions were economic carpet bombing, which I think's, I mean, that's how some people around the world kind of see it. So they don't want to use dollars, not for economic reasons, but because they want to take a little bit of a swerve around SWIFT and some of the controls that go with it. And so, for example, I was just reading today the FinCEN, you know, revised ruling about cryptocurrencies is now saying you have to implement the travel rule for transactions above $250, which means if I want to send $250 to Chris in Poland, I've got to spray my personally identifiable information all across the internet with no guarantee that it will be unmolested in transit. What does that say to me? That doesn't say to me, okay, good, what that says to me is, well, maybe I'll find a way I can send the money that doesn't go through exchanges. You know, I've been watching Queen of the South, right? You've seen that show, Queen of the South? It's about Mexican drug dealing narco terrorists. And, you know, and in one of the episodes, she puts all her money on a USB and a Bitcoin cold wallet on a USB stick and sends that around instead to Malta, I think she's in, I can't remember. But you know what I mean? It's like, it's not obvious that people will carry on using dollars because of its economic position. There are other factors involved in people's choice of currencies for transactional purposes.
So Dave and Chris, you both have touched upon these two issues in the context of some of the writing that you've done on this subject. So the two issues are privacy and what Dave just highlighted, sort of the politics of things. How does this weigh in with respect to the debate?
Me?
Well, the political aspects is central to everything. You know, everything in our lives has some relationship with government and politics, whether we like it or not. And we may want to be libertarians and get away from government and politics, but it's all about power and control. And as I said earlier, again, if you take that away, you have anarchy. So I don't know which you would prefer. I kind of quite like a society that's stable. I'm not so keen on politicians who use power for their own purposes, of which there are many. No names mentioned, but you know who I'm talking about. And power and control is really interesting again right now. I got thrown out of an American conference in 2006 for saying how China would rule the world in banking. You know, it wasn't in manufacturing. And Americans don't like that message. Surprise, surprise. Yeah, in 2020, you look at the world and China is the superpower. It may not be the #1 superpower, depending on how you measure these things, but it's near enough. And that's the reason why Donald Trump created the whole China-US trade wars and tariffs. So we end up with a difficult conversation, because when I look at the future, and I think Dave's the same actually, I look at it purely from a technological viewpoint. So if I see something beautiful in technological terms, then I rave about it. And I've raved a lot about China's technology companies and the beauty of what they're doing these days. But if I looked at it in political and economic terms, I'd be feeling very, very different. But I remove the political, economic, and social things from the conversation. And that's one of the core things about when you look at the future. It's political, economic, social, and technological. I only look at the technological thing, and I recognize the political, economic, and social things. But the technological things are what astound and amaze and interest me. And right now, the most astounding and amazing, interesting area of the world in technological terms is China.
Dave?
Several different responses. So, I mean, you know, on the one hand, there's an argument which says, actually, this is just restoring the status quo, because up until I can't remember, was it 1750 or something, China was the richest and most powerful country in the world anyway, and it just went through a bit of a blip, you know, to do with industrial revolutions and this sort of thing. And now it's going back on track. But I listened to an interesting podcast the other day with Niall Ferguson, the historian, who I hate because he wrote such a good book about the history of money. It just bothers me. But he's a very thoughtful person about these kind of things. And he said, you know, it's not as straightforward as it seems, because actually, you know, driving forward a one-party regime and expecting it to deliver the same levels of imagination and creativity and invention as a more liberal system is it's a tough ask as people become so China's pace of change has been amazing, and whatever you think about the system there, you've got to take your hat off to the fact that there have been hundreds of millions of people raised out of poverty in a relatively short time, and I mean, that is absolutely incredible. But I'm not sure you can project that indefinitely into the future, because as the economy shifts from manufacturing to you know, services, I mean, in ways that we all understand. I remember I won't say the country, but I remember many years ago I was working in a Southeast Asian country, and I was doing some work for the government. And I remember sitting in a meeting where somebody was discussing potentially having targets for more creativity. There wasn't enough creativity, so the government wanted to introduce a 5% target for more creativity. Well, that sort of thing just doesn't work. So, I mean, let's not give up on America just yet. For the obvious reason, Kevin, that now that Meghan is there, and you know, Meghan's son could become president and king of England, thus reuniting the countries in my long-held dream. You know, there are other visions of the future ahead of us.
That's the
Yeah, I'm an optimistic person, you know, and honestly, Chris, that Tea Party thing, I mean, it's literally water under the bridge now, isn't it? I mean, it's literally water under the bridge. So let's have a positive view of the future.
Well, Dave, Chris, thank you very much for your thoughts today. I think we've just scratched the surface of this conversation. We could go on for quite a long time. Unfortunately, we're going to start to lose our audience soon.
Yep.
The ones that are still awake, there's a few of them.
Any final thoughts?
No, just to echo your point. I mean, I mean, I'm allowed to mention it. I mean, when I started writing my book about it, I was writing it in the context of talking about sort of 3 to 5 year scenario planning with some of the financial organizations I was working with. But the pandemic has absolutely accelerated the interest. So now every central bank is having the Bank of International Settlements, the ECB, not just because of Libra, but because of the pandemic and other circumstances. So digital currency has become a real topic, you know, much quicker than people like me thought, actually.
Chris?
Yeah, I think from my side, I've written a couple of times now that 2030 was turbocharged to 2020, in that we've seen an acceleration in the last year of everything to be digital. And it's not just currencies, it's everyone working from home, employees at home, all the banks moving to cloud-based services that they thought were too risky and insecure before, but now they're using them. Everyone avoiding cash and paying electronically with mobile wallets and other services. And, you know, I don't know about you guys, but I've survived for the past year mainly because I could get big companies on the internet to deliver something to the end of my street, to my door, kids, and without that, we'd have gone insane. So digital is today.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Dave, thank
That's
you.
a good point.
Yes.
I guess for my part, you know, sort of turn it over to Betsy. My quick two observations to sort of go back to the first story, which I think Chris and Dave have highlighted amply, which is we need to have trust in the system, trust that good things will happen as well as bad things won't happen, and we have to have stability. So with that, I'll turn it back to Betsy.
Thank you all very much. It was a very interesting conversation. Having started my career in currency trading, I find having so many new currencies is going to be an interesting thing to look at in the world, and how do all these currencies interop with each other. But so thank you very, very much. I would like to just close by making a plug for our next event. So on December 3rd, we will be having a demo night from some of the winners from the Remittance Technology Awards that are happening this week. So this week, the IMTC, the International Money Transfer Conference, is going on, and they're having Remittance Technology Awards, and we're going to have a demo night. Also, if anybody has ideas for next year for NYPAY, you know, we're an education and networking group, let us know. We're more than happy to take any new ideas, any ideas for anybody. So thank you all very, very much, and hopefully we'll see you on December 3rd. In the evening, and with that night we are going to stay a little longer. We're going to schedule for an hour and a half and do a few breakout groups. But thank you all very much. I see we're asked about the recording, and yes, we normally do recordings. I remembered to turn on the recording, so it is recorded. But thank you all very much. And by the way, both, as most people do know, Chris and David have both written books. So feel free to, you know, Google their books and take a look at it. I'm definitely, after having them, very interested in it. Thank you, everybody. Bye.
That was fun.
Thank you as
very
well.
much.
And David, after all
Bye,
these years of
guys.
knowing you, I've never seen you without a beard, so this has been fun.
Talk soon, guys.
All best. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Au revoir.